Hello everyone, my name is Teresa Kellett. On behalf of WorkUp, I'd like to welcome you to Safe and Together, working at the speed of trust. I would like to begin today by acknowledging that this forum is being recorded on unceded Yagara and Turrbal lands and pay my respects to elders past and present. Wherever we are joining from today, we are on unceded Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land. I also acknowledge and pay respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this session. It's a pleasure to have you all join us. Spark webinars are an opportunity to connect practitioners with current research, promoting knowledge sharing across the sector and creating a space for reflecting, thinking and talking about practice. Today we're joined by three experienced leaders in domestic and family violence practice and research. Marlene Lau is a Wiradjuri and Ngunnawal woman, an Aboriginal leader, researcher and long-standing educator with New South Wales Health, and a chief investigator on the ALFIES project. Jackie Ruck is a Yidinji woman and the Asia Pacific Regional Manager with the Safe and Together Institute, bringing deep expertise in supporting practitioners to apply the model in practice. We're also joined by Cherie Toivonen, Director of CLT Byron Consulting and Research Project Manager for ALFIES, who has led important work exploring whole-of-family approaches to domestic and family violence. Together, they'll take us inside the ALFIES project and explore what it means to apply the Safe and Together framework through an Aboriginal lens. Our speakers will unpack how the framework aligns with Aboriginal ways of knowing, being and doing, what practitioners can learn from its application, and what it takes to build meaningful, trust-based relationships in our work with families. This is an opportunity to deepen your practice, challenge assumptions, and consider how small shifts, both individually and within organisations, can lead to more culturally responsive and effective support. Welcome, panellists.
Good morning.
Thank you.
Jackie, let's start with you. Most of our audience will be somewhat familiar with the Safe and Together program, but for those who aren't, can you tell us a bit about what it is and who it's for?
Absolutely. Firstly, I want to say what it's not, okay? It's not a no removal sort of model, and it's not just for child safety, okay? Safe and Together is a practice sort of framework that any professionals who are working with families impacted by domestic and family violence, they can use it in whatever sector they are in. Its core idea is both simple and it's radical. It's the perpetrator's behaviour and not the survivor's choice that is the source of danger to the children. So once you shift that lens and those changes, it changes how you interview, it changes how you assess, how you sort of document your cases and how you make decisions about families. So the model was initially done and created by David for the child protection system, but over time it's sort of evolved and we see that it's, it makes the perpetrator visible and to map his behaviours, the impact on the children and hold him accountable while generally partnering with the non-offending parent and not treating her as the problem, right? It must be used in everywhere that you go. I mean, in child protection, in health, in police and DV services, education, Indigenous organisations, okay? Because the problem of blaming mothers and ignoring fathers does not live in just one system. It lives in all of them, okay? And there's multiple agencies out there, and this framework gives you the language to use across systems and talk the same language so that, users of violence and perpetrators can't use systems against our most vulnerable. The model is particularly relevant in regions of, diverse and First Nations communities because we're navigating sort of common, very complex things like intersectionalities and understanding how race, culture, how colonisation or structural sort of disadvantage shape most experiences of people from diverse natures and stuff like that. But their experience of violence and the system's responses, that come from practitioners. So this is a model that sort of we're all using together. At its heart, Safe and Together is about accountability and putting that responsibility back to where it belongs, and that's the person who chooses to use violence. And about partnership, walking alongside of sort of survivors rather than adding to that burden. It's about it's not about inventing new programs. It's about transforming how practitioners think, and thinking is where sort of change begins.
Thanks, Jackie. It was a great description of the program. I love that reframe from it's not about her choices, it's about his behaviour.
Absolutely.
Cherie, the ALFIES project, it's a great name. Can you tell us a bit about what the project was aiming to do and what you did?
Yeah, thanks, Teresa. So the ALFIES project came on the back of a number of projects that the University of Melbourne led with the Safe and Together Institute. And it was becoming more broader because the previous research projects looked at the practices for staff across all the service sectors when working with women and children and families experiencing domestic and family violence, and looking at the intersections as well. So where there was drug and alcohol use, there was mental health concerns, and when there was child protection involved. But the ALFIES project wanted to go broader than that and really look at how the impacts of colonisation and systemic racism, intergenerational trauma, and impacts of past and current systems abuses also was part of that, part of the work. And so it really wanted to move through the exploration of those practices, but this time with Aboriginal-led services. And so the idea was not, in a sense, a traditional research project where someone might develop the research questions and develop the methodology and then go in and invite participants to be part of the research project. It was really a co-designed methodology, and it was really about not bringing in a white kind of Western overseas model to local services in New South Wales, but rather really looking at how two ACCHOs in New South Wales were working with families experiencing domestic and family violence and working with them holistically, and seeing if the Safe and Together model could bolster that practice or align with that practice, or kind of see how the two ways of working could come together, and if there was a middle ground there. And that was sort of the new knowledge that the research team were hoping to develop. The whole project was Aboriginal-led and co-designed from the development of the research team, all the way through to the methodology. And we worked with incredible people. We had an incredible Aboriginal steering committee. We had an incredible Aboriginal-led research team, and then the beautiful, wonderful research partners who were so generous with their time to work with us on this project, Waminda and Katungal, the two Aboriginal community-controlled organisations. So it was really about working out how the practices aligned, and how they could be further developed to really support families experiencing domestic and family violence.
Thanks, Cherie. I think that approach that's really carefully thought out and really well designed from the start. We'll see a bit as we go through the conversation today about the results that taking that approach really, gave to the project and the things that you found along the way. So, Marlene, the webinar is called Working at the Speed of Trust, but what does it mean to work at the speed of trust?
That's a great question, Teresa, and it actually is about everything about the project. What we know is many of our communities say we're the most over-researched, consulted people in Australian society, and many communities say we're actually, tired of that, and we're tired of trying to fit in with researchers and, Western services wanting to introduce their, Western projects or into communities. That does not work. So what was really, really important that we assured that we did in practice was working at the speed of trust. And that's about assuring that the community are welcoming us in, firstly, that we are engaging, we're slowly getting to know the community and letting the community know us. There's been so much mistrust within our communities, with government, service providers. When we look at this country, our communities are still not accessing a lot of services due to that mistrust. So it's important that we be aware of that and that we show trustworthiness, that we, move at their pace. We be aware of if there's sorry business happening in their community or anything else that may be getting in the way of them being able to engage with us. It must be community-led, and as it says, at their speed and with the respect of them being, that have all the knowledge within their communities. We have to let them know that we are letting them lead the project. We're letting them lead the engagement, the communication, and we will follow respectfully at the speed of trust.
Thanks, Marlene. Such an important foundation to start this work and start thinking about this project. We are going to talk about what you learned through the project, but before we move on to that, I just want to ask each of you why you think this project was important. So Jackie, I might throw to you first.
Sure.
What was it about this project that was so important to you?
Well, I've got about 4 things
Great.
I want to talk about.
Tell me all about it.
Firstly, I think it addressed the critical gap of while Safe and Together is a model and it's adapted across the states, across the world even, and it's adopted across Australia, there's little evidence of whether it works for Aboriginal communities. All right. So as we know that, there were communities that experienced family violence at such a high rate. So we wanted to know, and the question is generally, does this model fit? And if so, how does it fit? Secondly, it was Aboriginal-led. So rather than having our Western framework come in and impose our outside views, the project was designed and driven by Aboriginal women and researchers and created with 2 beautiful actos, which was Waminda and Katangal. And it was governed through Aboriginal data sovereignty principles. Okay, so the voices and the expertise of Aboriginal workers were centred at every stage of what we did. So this is not research done on them or not Aboriginal communities, but with us, okay? Thirdly, it looked at and it took colonisation seriously as a context. So the project didn't just treat domestic violence as an isolated problem. Okay, it recognised that the impacts of colonisation, stolen generations, intergenerational trauma, systemic racism, institutional violence, and it looked at how it may shape why family violence occurs and why mainstream systems often fail or actively harm our Aboriginal families. In the same sense, it does not use, we don't use violence as an excuse, our culture as an excuse. Finally, the findings were practically useful. So workers from both organisations had strong alignments with the Safe and Together model and their existing approaches on how they're working, particularly around partnering with women, how they map behaviours of perpetrators, and working holistically with families. So the model is a holistic one that these 2 agencies could see that it could work, but it also identified what needed to change. More attention to the intergenerational trauma, localised language, culturally safe sort of delivery, and moving at the speed of trust, okay? Because that combination of validation and honest critique makes ALFIES sort of the project a generally sort of valuable contribution in this field.
Wow, and ditto to everything Jackie just said, beautifully, explained. One thing I'd like to add is a little bit going back to what Cherie said about the project prior to the ALFIE, and what was identified from that project was that it has to be all of what Jackie just said. They had what they call COPs, Community of Practice, and many Aboriginal participants, workers that attended these COPs said, there's been no consultation with Aboriginal communities. How do we know this, again, another Western model, going to work for us? And our wonderful David Mendel, who has taken all this research, information and knowledge and evidence on board, he made a comment and said, we've worked with our First Nations people over here, and that really alarmed one participant, and they come back to me and they said, Marlene, we can't have them thinking that because they've worked with their First Nations people that's going to work for us. We're a whole different people. We have our own ways of knowing, being and doing. And David Mendel took that on board. I come on board at that time and was able to invite more Aboriginal participants in, and we got to hear more of the First Nations voices around what's going to work, what won't, what should the Safe and Together model look like if it's going to come into our communities, which is everything that Jackie just shared. So really wrap that.
I'd like to add that sort of I can't assume, being an Aboriginal myself, that I speak on behalf of everyone. So it's got to be community-led. And
that's exactly right, and we'll talk a bit more about that. But as Jackie says, even as First Nations people, we still have to work at the speed of trust. Think about what is this project, what are we offering the community, and is it going to work? Because many, many, many Western practices and projects do not work for our communities, and so it's important that we be mindful of that and that we be respectful and be thinking about, before we go in, is this going to work, and who do we engage with to assure that it does? Who's going to invite us in and allow us to offer this opportunity?
Beautiful. Thanks, Marlene. Thanks, Jackie. Cherie, do you want to add to that? What was important to you?
Thanks, Teresa. Yeah, absolutely what Miles and Jackie said. Absolutely agree 100% with all of that. And I do think as well, we often don't get time to be able to work in this way in research projects or other sorts of projects that are very KPI driven and outcomes driven and with very tight timelines. So this project was really important because it didn't hold fast to those rules that we normally have. And so, the Ministry of Health who funded this project, they really were committed to working at the speed of trust and really committed to developing the relationships with the ACCHOs who were our partners. So, it's a very different way of looking at a research participant to being a research partner, and all the workers there were our partners. And it was such a reciprocal learning experience for everyone. So the research team learned a lot from the research partners. And I think from what the ACCHOs were saying, they learned a lot from Jackie and Marlene as well, being part of the yarning circle. So it was a real privilege, and we're so lucky. I feel so lucky to have been part of a project that was set up like that and stayed true to that as well, and stayed true to the data sovereignty, so that the Wominda and Katungal own the data. It's not that the researchers own the data, and we kept true to that, and true to all the AH and MRC, medical Aboriginal Medical Health Research Council principles all the way through, and it was ethically a good project as well, I think. So important on all those levels as well.
Really important, and I think that having the funder on board from the start with that way of working, absolutely essential. You wouldn't have been able to do any of that if it wasn't set up that way from the start.
And the funding body, Ministry of Health, said there is no way that we will support the Safe and Together training, especially for our First Nations people, until we do this research project and we, are sure that we're not only working at the speed of trust, but meeting the needs of our communities in relation to, child protection, family and domestic violence. Yeah.
And Safe and Together had to be open to any criticism that may come along, because we do want to make it sort of have this model working wherever it possibly could.
Yeah, so important. So turning to what you actually did in the project and how that went, I understand that the participants in your research received training and then they also joined yarning circles to further embed that learning. Jackie, did you have to adapt the Safe and Together content for this audience?
Absolutely. Look, initially, David and I did some training together, and then I did the community of practices on my own with the group. So, firstly, the adaptation wasn't a one-off adjustment, okay? It was a whole approach on how training was designed and developed and built on the principle of moving at the speed of trust. Rather than using a standard formula, sort of David and I did bespoke training, and we made sure that it was responsive sort of to the Katangal and Waminda. The content was adapted to the participants in the room. It was delivered. It wasn't delivered as a fixed sort of, curriculum. The foundations and concepts of Safe and Together were discussed explicitly sort of in the context of colonisation, of intergenerational trauma, gender double standards, racism. Okay, so the models framework was held alongside of those sort of realities on how Aboriginal workers live and work in their sort of everyday life and communities. I think another adaptation was who delivered the training and the yarning circles. So as an Aboriginal woman myself, and being a part of an employee of Safe and Together, this was central. All right, to the training sort of cultural safety. So my lived experience as an Aboriginal woman, mother, practitioner, landed differently than someone with credentials-based sort of delivery would have. So Marlene Lau, of course, the Aboriginal research team and the project providing those additional sort of cultural sort of groundings for everything. Workers reflecting that hearing, Aboriginal women who spoke from our lived experiences of domestic and family violence and not from a context sort of textbook. It made it genuine and it made it trustworthy. So the language was also adapted. So people didn't like perpetrators. So we asked the group, what do you like? Person using violence, user of violence. So every training I did, I made sure I used their language. And perhaps the most importantly, the yarning circles that followed. They weren't just about data collection. Okay, they functioned as ongoing reflective practice sort of spaces, allowing the model to be tested, to be questioned, to be refined, okay, through Aboriginal world, ways of being, doing and seeing in real time. The end.
So, Marlene, I'm interested in hearing more about the participants' experiences of the yarning circles. What can you tell us about those?
Well, it was after, because, of course, as Jackie just said, we provided the training and it had to be culturally safe. So setting up safety and, as Jackie said, trust, all of that. So once the training was provided, it was about then developing our circle yarns. And why we call it circle yarning is because our people relate to that. Our people have been doing everything in circle work for over 60,000 years. Everything's done in circle. Why? Because we don't come from a patriarchal society. We come from a society where there's equity, There's many reasons our people did things in circles. And, you know, it's one of the best ways to engage, to communicate, to be heard, to have a voice. All of those things is represented in circle work. So the first thing we said is, this is practice is going to be, these yarns are going to be done in circle work. And the community, the participants could relate to that. You know, we'd sit around. At one stage, we sat outside around a non-burning fire, you know, just to have those yarns. That way, people felt they could speak honestly, that they could feel heard, felt like that they were equal. No one held any power in that, which is what the beauty of doing circle work does. So I recommend for any organisations going out and yarning with our communities, engaging or running any, whether it's projects, trainings, is that you do things in circle. Because that way you're going to get everything you want from that community, and the community are going to get everything they want from you. So they were vital. And the participants, you know, really, really appreciated us coming. Sometimes, a couple of times we had to cancel. And that's what you've got to do, because there was sorry business in the community, or, you know, there could have been, sadly, a suicide or something that happened in community. And that's where we had to be really respectful and go, that's okay. You let us know when we come in. And I've got to say the funding body was really, really culturally appropriate in that way as well. So we would approach them, this is what's happening, and they would support us with, you know, working at the speed of trust. So the yarning circles were vital for that wonderful communication and connection.
Beautiful. Cherie, you are not an Aboriginal woman, and yet you held power in this space as a researcher. So what did this mean for you and your practice?
I guess just could I say quickly first though, in terms of facilitating the yarning circles, Marlene and Jackie did the most extraordinary job, which allowed me to be part of the process. So before the yarning circles even happened, there was lots and lots and lots of communication with Waminda and Katango. Lots of meetings before, lots of checking in. Marlene would check in a lot. Marlene did a lot of work individually with people who were going to be in the yarning circle, and Jackie went out of her way and travelled with us to go and do the Safe and Together content and input into the yarning circles. So I guess, sorry, that's it. Oh, sorry, Miles, what was that?
Plenty of sweets, Cherie.
Yes.
Food is always important.
Yeah. So that was that. If we didn't have that, I don't think I would perhaps be as welcomed in to the yarning circles, because Marlene did the cultural brokerage and Jackie also did that too. So I think it was a bit about working together, like Marlene, Jackie and I working together, and me really being very mindful of that power and being respectful and following the cultural protocols that had been put in place at the beginning. I had also was lucky enough to do the decolonising workshop with Waminda at the very beginning, and so I was very conscious of that moving through all the time. And I really wanted to make sure that I never took over the space or, you know, spoke over or did anything like that. And I really did take my cues and my lead from Miles and Jackie. So when you see the power, Teresa, I'm hoping I didn't have much power in there. That's what I'm hoping. But I really felt very, very, very welcomed and definitely part of the yarns and part of the conversations. Do you think that's right, Miles?
I'd love to add to that.
Me too.
Yeah, I think Cherie's been very humble, and
yes.
But thinking about what Cherie has said, you know, for our other practitioners or others wanting to go in and work with community, it's always good to know who your cultural brokers in the area are.
Yeah.
And I saw myself as a cultural broker because even though I've got to work hard at building trust with a community that's not my own, what community will do, especially if there's non-Aboriginal members coming in is they'll borrow off your cultural trust. Yeah. So we often say borrow off the back of your cultural broker, borrow that trust. May I add, Cherie certainly didn't need much of that because just the way she demonstrated absolute respect, humility, and, so informed herself on all the cultural protocols and what is culturally respectful and practice every one of those. And there was times that I started to get jealous because they were contacting Cherie all the time and, they were going to Cherie and I said, Cherie, you need to know that this is a marvellous outcome and this tells me that you have absolutely built trust and you've been trustworthy. Yeah. And, as non-Aboriginal people, we do have to do that hard work. Non-Aboriginal people have to create that trustworthiness and build that trust. And our people are one of the most generous people that walk this country. Believe you me, once you have that trust, they are absolutely reciprocal, warm, welcoming, and will certainly look after you. I'm sure that was your experience, hey, Cherie?
Absolutely, yes.
And I just want to say, to toot your horn, yes, is that you were accepted into the community there. Yes, it may have been on the back of sort of, your cultural brokerage, but Cherie was accepted and she actually gave people space.
She waited.
She waited, and when there was silence, she didn't feel that she had to fill that gap. And that's what made them feel safe as well. So kudos to you, my friend.
She went at the speed of trust.
Absolutely.
What a ringing endorsement. And also I think it's so important to know that it's important to do this work well and that you can do it well as a non-Aboriginal person, which I think is a huge barrier for people. There's fear about doing things wrong, about making a mistake, but, hearing that your experience was very different because of the way that you approached it and the intention that you gave to that work is a really good, it's an excellent model for other people to follow, Cherie.
You bring up a great point too, Torres, because many non-Aboriginal organisations, government bodies will not go into community. And therefore our communities, human rights, safety, all of those things are not being met because non-Aboriginal workers and orgs are intimidated or nervous about doing the wrong thing or nervous about not being invited or able to work with that community. But when all those cultural protocols are put in place and you move at the speed of trust and you do all that Cherie did, it does work. Our communities are wanting to work with non-Aboriginal people. We're only 2.5% of the population in this country. Aboriginal people, First Nations workers can't do this alone. We need our safe co-workers. We need collaboration with non-Aboriginal people, non-Aboriginal workers for us to really, really make a difference in our communities.
Thanks, Mums.
Well said. Really well said. Holding that, there also has been criticism in the past that Safe and Together uses a very white, a very Western worldview, a way of looking and being in the world that may not translate into culturally safe practice in our First Nations communities across the country. Miles, can you speak to how the framework does and does not align to Aboriginal ways of knowing and doing?
Well, Teresa, like a lot of Western models, since colonisation of this country, our people have had to try and manoeuvre, assimilate, try and work with a culture that's not their own, a dominant culture, a Western culture. And the Safe and Together model would have just been another one of those models that has been developed by non-Aboriginal worldviews, research, knowledge, data, all of that stuff. And it's important that what happened here with this project, that the Safe and Together model informed themselves around what do we need to do differently if we are really serious about going into our Aboriginal communities across this nation and making a difference. Our children are waiting for that difference. Many of our children are still not getting their child rights, human rights, all of those things met. We need to assure that all our models are working in a way that has an Aboriginal worldview to be able to go in to make a difference in partnerships. This is why we've got our Aboriginal organisations across this country. Our Aboriginal orgs are developed and created for safety, to have an Aboriginal worldview, to do things in a way that our people connect with and can relate to. So I think it's important that the Safe and Together model really embraces this research and implements it in their model. And if I could say, they already have. You know, David Mendel and the whole team, I mean, you know, just by appointing Jackie has made such a huge difference. You know, mob are looking for Jackie all the time. Just that face. You know, David and his team have absolutely took on all the research knowledge, not just that, the voices of all those that were involved in the COPs, everything that comes his way, he's going, okay, this is what we have to embed. If we're to take these into community, we can't ignore what's been said. We can't keep putting a square peg in a round hole, which is what's happening across our communities still to this day. And that's why we're still overrepresented right across the board, sadly, in all the areas that we don't want to be represented. Yeah.
So I'm hearing that with, you know, intentional work, practice and thought, that you can absolutely use the Safe and Together model in
It might take at the speed of trust. It might take working differently. It might take having to park our biases, our worldviews, our ways of doing and thinking that they're right and they're right for all. It takes a lot of doing all of that. And sometimes our funding bodies don't allow it. Our orgs haven't got the time, or, you know, think, why fix something that's not broken? But if I can say, when you're looking at our communities, it's broken. The system's broken.
So, Jackie, there was quite a lot of work, obviously, that was done with the Wominda and Katungal. There was a lot of support given by the Ministry of Health in funding this project that set you on a good track for this project. Yeah. Does that mean that you need all of that work to implement Safe and Together in an Aboriginal-led organisation, or could it be implemented in any Aboriginal-led organisation?
It could be. Look, the short answer is yes. You know, research has found that Safe and Together can be implemented into any ACHO sort of organisation, but it's how you do it, okay? And that's what matters. The report is clear. There's a report, you know, that careful preparation. Without that careful preparation, it's not going to work. Right. All right, the ALFIES project identified strong alignments, you know, with it being holistic and stuff like that. But I think firstly, the process has to move at the speed of trust. The most important message is that Aboriginal-led organisations are still, you know, they're still navigating sort of structural racism and ongoing assimilation pressures, but rushing this implementation and treating it like a tick box, that's not good enough, okay? It will fail. So funders will need to be built on generous frameworks, you know, time frames, and resource it quite well. Another one critical to sort of preparation and engagement and training. Before any training begins, organisations need time to build that honest relationship and develop that cultural safety protocols, just like they did in the project. And establishing brave spaces and yarns, safe yarns and conversations. That's the basic need for, you know, when you're working with ACOs and around sort of family violence. training itself must be delivered with the cultural lens, and ideally by a First Nations sort of trainer with local knowledge. Where the trainer is not Aboriginal, look for a co-facilitator, who is. And having that co-facilitator isn't an option, it's necessary, okay? I don't think it's mandatory, and training alone is never enough. So yarning circles, supporting that ongoing sort of practice, implementation is essential. Organisational readiness matters. If leadership, like the ministry, leadership needs to be have an authorising environment and have capacity to embed the model into existing works. And finally, language must be localised. So the model has been redone, and I just finished it with Deb, my partner, in Safer Together, and we've got a new Safer Together that's Australian, that has a lot of cultural knowledges in it. Yeah. So the short answer is yes, but only if there's good DV strategies in place where implementation is genuine, it's co-designed, it's community-led, it's resourced properly from the start. But with no implementation, the strategies to put it in place will fail.
So it's possible. You just can't skip any of those really important steps. No. And you can't assume because it worked somewhere else, you can just copy and paste into another community.
Definitely localised.
We know, and we talk about localisation a lot. I can't just go and take this training from Southside, of Australia and take it over to the other side and think it's going to work. I have to tweak it.
Every community is different.
Absolutely.
Every First Nations person's different. Another important thing that came out of the research was that the participants have an understanding of core domestic violence to be able to. Thank you. If you want to talk.
Yeah. Well, that's in my other question. Sorry. Answers. But absolutely, they need DV 101 to start with.
Yeah. To really complement, so that the Safe and Together model absolutely complements that work.
Did you want to add anything else, Marlene? What else do we need to be mindful of?
I think is dual relationships, and our communities are so different to, Western society, so different. We had participants say, how do I, implement the Safe and Together model when, the brother boy that I've got to work with, I play footy with, I grew up with him. My children hang with these children, like we're small communities, we're forever juggling dual relationships. So having an Aboriginal participant in the facilitator in the room to be able to talk to that is vital, and to have an understanding of our communities. There is dual relationships. There's all of that manoeuvring that our people are having to do that is very different to a non-Aboriginal worker working with any communities, is being aware of the differences that's in our community. And one of the big things is those dual relationships.
And we're not saying stop what you're doing as an Aboriginal organisation, community. No, we just want to give you language. We just want to give you extra tools in your kit, just to, when it is difficult, you have been brought up with people in your community. How do you separate your role, And we do have different hats. And how do you use that to your best advantage? So the language is good.
That's really important. You don't have to stop what you're doing. It's more adding skills and adding a way of thinking.
Listening to the community, hearing what's not working and what's working, implement it. Yeah.
Cherie, coming to you again. What do non-Aboriginal Safe and Together facilitators need to do this work successfully with Aboriginal people?
I think Miles and Jackie have just nailed it with everything they've just said then about being locally led and developing relationships and taking the time and understanding the local context. And I think as a non-Aboriginal facilitator or worker in the space, it's that really critical partnership with an Aboriginal co-facilitator, and doing the work with them, the pre-work and the engagement work, and the connecting work beforehand. That's really important. And also as a non-Aboriginal person, really understanding the historical context of the area. Like, we learned a lot about the two geographical areas where we did the work down on the south coast of New South Wales, really understanding the history of what's happened there, and also really adhering, like being part of the development of the cultural protocols and the safety, and really adhering to that. I think the thing about sitting back and listening and not taking over, because I think you know, like coming into a space as a non-Aboriginal person, you will never understand what those local relationships are. Like Marlene talking about, you know, the wonderful men we worked with in the project, having to manage like 10 different roles within a small community. And, you know, we can never say, well, then try this or do this, or, you know, it's that really respectful listening and finding where there might be an alignment in the space. And, you know, I'm not sure if we're going to get to that, but talking about the tool, like the Safety Together tools and the alignments, there were definitely alignments around where the work can happen, but it's about being respectful to find those spaces. And like what Miles and Jackie were saying, creating the safe space to have the brave conversations around domestic and family violence and how you work with that and deal with that in a small community. I think those things are really important.
And I just want to add, Cherie, you bring up a great point. And what we did, a learning we took from this went on to the Christie project that we did, and the importance of having those cultural sort of brokers in the room for that project. So we learnt from this project to replicate it in the Christie project.
Jackie, going back to you. So after the work that you did with the training and the yarning circles and all of the work that you did you notice that participants spoke about different ways of working? Did they change their practice? What did you actually hear them say after the work that you did?
Well, I think when I got them into the community of practices, I could see that they were now coming from and asking questions that came from curiosity, which is a big thing that Safe and Together sort of talks about, is being curious. Why is she doing what she's doing? Once we ask the question of what happens if she doesn't do this, we then see the context of why she's doing what she's doing in the context of the behaviours of the use of violence. So, yeah. Did I answer that?
Yeah, you certainly did. So you noticed that people changed
their language.
They came from a position of curiosity.
Yes, their language.
And I think we have some examples that people might be seeing on the screen at the moment too, some case studies where people actually changed the way that they thought about the work and the way they approached the work, the way that they changed the questions that they asked people and who they asked the questions to.
And how they challenge service providers, especially child protection.
Absolutely.
Around saying, you know, the mapping, you know, where, you know, we know we've got a history of sometimes, sadly, mother blaming, victim blaming, women blaming. And what the Safe and Together model does is it just completely, you know, throws that out the window and brings in what we used to call the invisible man into the situation, the person who chooses to use violence. And using workers, participants said that they now use the Safe and Together model to challenge the child protection workers around, have you mapped, have you actually identified what he's doing to cause mum not to be able to access those appointments or get the children to school. Yeah. And the note-taking, you know, there's another big tool around how important note-taking is. Note-taking from the, you know, service providers has been very harmful. If, you know, the person taking the notes isn't aligning with the strengths of mum, you know, comes in with their own biases, or the notes prior to the mentoring has already set their mind to what they're, you know, going to see and what they choose to observe. So all of those tools you'll see in the report, feedback from the participants, is what they use not only for themselves, but when challenging workers that themselves aren't aware of.
And you could hear that.
Yeah.
You can hear that in the questions they were asking me. You could hear it in the way they were actually giving advice to each other.
Yeah.
Have you thought about X, Y, and Z? So it was really good to see that.
Yeah.
Partnering with mum.
Partnering, the language.
It's a real sign that those learnings are actually embedded into their thinking and their approach. Cherie, did you want to jump in on that? Or was there anything else you wanted to add about the changes that you might have observed or heard?
Yeah, I think to really reinforce what Mel said about the mapping tool being able to be used to advocate to other mainstream services, and particularly child protection, because the mapping tool allows the worker to really identify where the harm is coming from, and most often it's the person using violence, whereas child protection system in the past and currently as well continue to mother blame. And so it was a real tool and benefit to be able to use that to advocate for clients, and also for the misidentification work as well. So the mapping tool can really locate and identify who is the person using violence. And so that major issue about misidentification of the perpetrator, it can really challenge that too. So that was really fantastic. And I also think what you're saying, Miles, about the partnering with women, that's something that Waminda and Katunga were doing very strongly anyway. So it just was like, it just highlighted that. It just highlighted where the Safe and Together model aligned with the current practices. So like you say, Miles, all the findings are in the report, but there were a lot of alignments, and they were around the tools and around the principles as well. And that's about keeping children safe and together with safe people, and also keeping the person using violence visible. And so that looked different in both of the communities and both of the ACCHOs, you know, like about and how they did that, and particularly keeping men as, if, you know, the man, if he was the person using violence, keeping him accountable and responsible, but also recognising his past history of trauma as well. And so having all of those kind of circles of, you know, thinking and considerations with an intersectional lens and a decolonising lens, it really kind of showed how complicated and complex every approach is, you know, like how you need to be thinking of all the complexities in each approach with each person you're working with. But there's definitely alignments there, and useful. Like I could see that the participants were saying, or our partners were saying, yeah, the model's useful in all of these ways.
And the model also talks about these men as fathers. How do they want to be seen as a father? You know, how do they want to role model fathering, and, you know, what a man, you know, looks like. So that's been helpful, and especially for our communities, because our people have been wanting to bring men and supports for their men into the picture for a long time. You know, they want the violence to stop, and they want their partner back, you know, choosing to not use violence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That real holistic working with the whole family approach.
That's right.
Yeah.
Working safely. Yeah.
Beautiful. So as you all know, this was a New South Wales project, but today we're joined by practitioners from all across Queensland, and I'm sure they're all wondering how they can take what you've learned in New South Wales and apply it in their local context. So if a practitioner's just starting to think about how they can do this work in their local communities, Marlene, where should they start?
They should certainly start by knowing their community. And we don't just get to know our communities by just turning up at a NAIDOC once a year. What we see is many of us as service providers, organisations, sometimes the first time our communities may engage or get or see you is when it's at the pointy end, when it's a crisis. We have to be better at building rapport and getting to know our communities and letting our communities know that we're a service there, not for, when it gets to a pointy end, but to support you, to help you parent, to help you maintain, your relationships, to help you live in safety. All of those things that service providers provide to families. And it's important to first really, really get to know your community and engage and let your community know you. Inform your community of what your organisation does, what you can provide, who you are. I think I just refer to my be knowledgeable, that's that localisation. Have absolute knowledge around what's happened for your communities, What are other service providers? Is there high rates of child removal in the area? That's important to know because you want to know that if you yourself are going to start engaging with that community and what sort of mistrust and fear is sitting in that community. So it's good to know that, to be very, very aware of your own biases, your own racism, your own white fragility, and your own common beliefs. Because we know that if you're holding any of those, it comes out and it's demonstrated in practice. So being really, really aware. And like Cherie, the training that Cherie went to prior to being involved with the ALFIE. The decolonisation that was run by an Aboriginal org. And as Cherie and many people just talk so highly of that, because it helps us to recognise our own, what I really bang on about, our own common beliefs, because we have a whole societal common beliefs, that I knew that, I was born into those common beliefs. If you ask First Nations people what the common beliefs are, they can feel this backboard, wall, I should say. And so really getting to know your own.
And probably to add on to that is knowing how the community see you.
Yes.
Say more about that, Jackie.
Yeah. Damn it. Just because with you, you don't want to go in blind. You don't want to go in, me as an Aboriginal woman, cannot assume that they will not see me as having power.
That's right.
So knowing why they won't use your service, why they distrust it, acknowledging that and being transparent, acknowledging that, there's been past historical events that have made you not trust me. How can we work better? What can I do to make you feel safer to engage our service? So that's another thing.
No, find cultural brokers. We've got many Aboriginal orgs and workers out there. Connect, build a rapport. Yep. Engage with them. Let them know you would love to provide a service for that community. Yeah. Borrow on them as a cultural broker that will, allow that trust and talk to community about that trust and allowing you in. And it is hard. It's hard when we're going in because what we're going in is to talk about some, things that that's not going to be comfortable. So, your language is important. How you go in and have those hard conversations. How do I have this hard conversation? Do I take a cultural broker to help me communicate that respectfully and safely? Listen, really listen, partner, with the individual that you're going in, or the elders of the community, those people that are really, really watching you, they're listening, they're waiting for you to build that trust. And they're waiting to see what you're here for. What are you really here for? Because there'll be a big wall up, and that wall is about safety, fear, all those things that we all know sadly encompasses our communities, because we've had 200 and something years of, sadly, child removal, mistrust, all the things that we know, that one of our biggest abusers have been systems. We are addressing family domestic violence, and this was one of the other things that the Safe and Together model assured that it was aware of, is how has this country, how have our services, how has our government harmed our people?
Yeah. And it's not accidental.
No. We're looking at systemic violence, abuse and neglect. Yeah.
Cherie, did you have anything to add to that in terms of the starting point for adapting or if you're trying to do this work in your own local community?
I think always remember that First Nations people, many First Nations people don't have the same level of safety, even everyday safety in the community or when they're approaching the service provider for something. And I think always have that in the back of your mind, and that should sort of inform your approach. I think as an individual worker, you consistently got to kind of think about unconscious bias or your bias and be really critically reflective in the space and in the work. And I do think starting from the notion that you will take on the colonial load that we often let our First Nations colleagues take, and then have that sort of decolonising approach to your practice. So almost like having sort of these basic sort of foundational underpinnings to how you are going to approach any work or any client, and then taking the time to develop the connections and the trust and all of the things that Marlene and Jackie said, I think are really important.
Thanks, Cherie.
Beautiful.
Jackie, talking about working in this Western framework and with the systems and structures that we have in place, how can we actually work at the speed of trust when we're working within these broader systems and structures that are very based on a totally different worldview?
Timeframes.
Dan, that's a good question. I think not working now. When we're saying working at the speed of trust, it's not just a slogan. It's actually fundamentally a different orientation on how we show up. Mm-hmm. And with the ALFIES project, what did it look like in practice? So Aboriginal communities, we've experienced sort of decades of being researched, like Miles said, and being imposed on without consent. Services sort of promise to sort of do like partnership and deliver good, services, but really it's under sort of surveillance. But that history doesn't disappear because your intentions are good, right? Trust must be earned, and that takes time. So showing up before you need anything, being seen by your community. All right. The ALFIES team, the research team, they spent months sort of building that relationship and having conversations with Katungal and Waminda before even having that single yarning circle. All right. So information sessions, phone calls that Cherie and Miles did was very important. Second is being led by the community and not by a timeline.
That's right.
All right. Research teams, we all run on a timeline. You have to think about, sorry, business, if there's been, events that have arose in the community, you have to make, plans shift. You have to move with that. Flexibility isn't sort of nice to have, it's essential. And it's actually a sign of respect for our people. All right. Making safety before making progress. So cultural, building that cultural protocol, develop with, and they did it with each organisation. Each organisation was different. They had their own different needs, and we're just not handing them. Okay, this is our cultural protocol. Actually, we learnt from them on what they needed to create sort of brave spaces to be able to talk and have those honest conversations. And, that had to be established long before Safe and Together stepped in. with our training. So you can't skip that. Another thing is transparency about power.
That's right.
So the project was explicit about that data sovereignty, about intellectual property, who owns it, and the generated knowledge from that. Aboriginal communities needed to know that what they shared remained with them. So, and perhaps most powerfully, having the patience and celebrating the small progresses rather than the rushing the outcome, okay? And, my people need time. I need time to process stuff. That's why it's all written, because I thought about what I want to tell you.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's it.
Just that. That's it.
That's it. Next, please.
Yeah.
Cherie, coming back to you, is the research published?
Yes, it is. We're
Where
so
can people find
excited. Everyone worked really hard on the final report. Everyone, the partners, everyone. So I think the slide might pop up. So it's on the Uni of Melbourne website. So you can click on the link there and download the report. We've also got some other resources that might be helpful for practitioners, and I think we've got those on the next slide. So Marlene and I were talking about the other Safe and Together uni projects. So one of them was called Esty and one of them was called Christie, and Jackie talked about learnings from ALFIES going into Christie. So they've also got reports connected to them, and they've also got these really beautiful practitioner guides. So they're really helpful, developed by practitioners, and they can really support the work no matter where you are on the kind of continuum of service provision. So if you're in emergency department or if you're working in a community development project, they kind of like sit across all of that. So they're really helpful. Jackie, I think we've got a link up there for Safe and Together as well. So you might want to talk about what resources or what's useful.
Thanks, Cherie. There's lots of free resources out there, and blogs, and research projects and evidence stuff that we've got there for free. There's free training, all right, that people can start with, and they range from, even when you go into the pricing, they range from $7 up to $119. So please go on and have a look. See what you can find in there. Yeah.
Some wonderful resources.
And we also did some work in the lead up to this webinar to give people a resource that they actually can use walking away from the webinar. And that was a set of reflective practice questions. Would you like to speak to those, Cherie?
Yeah, sure. So I think these practice questions that Marlene and Jackie sort of developed are critical, and they're kind of in two sort of sections about you and your service, and then also about the local community. So they're a little bit about all the things that we've been talking about today, but sometimes it's really useful to have a question to ask yourself, to kind of prompt yourself to actually start the work. So some of the questions about you and your service are, do you know your local community? How would you describe your understanding of the local Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander community where you work? How does your service demonstrate commitment to the community beyond events such as NAIDOC, as you said, Miles? How do you reflect on your own cultural positioning and potential biases when you're working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander clients? What cultural learnings or trainings have you undertaken? And how do you continue to build your understanding of local community protocols, or how do you develop those local protocols? So then if we're thinking about the local community, how do you connect with a cultural advisor or broker or a community contact? Like, how do you even begin that process? And is that a respectful decolonised process that you're bringing to that space in that first initial engagement with that person? Does your local community know how to contact your service for support? Like, are you open to having First Nations clients and women and children come to your service? If you think you are, have you really taken a deep look into that, rather than just having a picture on the wall? Do you have a trauma-informed space? Do you have, like, there's lots of things to be thinking about, as your service. Does your local community know you, know what to do, how to connect in with you? Do they know what to do if services don't respond? Does the community or do clients come to you outside of a crisis or mandatory reporting situation? I think that's a very telling question. And how do you think the community sees your service? And if you think that they don't see it as a good service, what can you do to respond to that?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I can imagine these questions, you could take them potentially to a team meeting, and you could maybe work through a different question at a different team meeting. You could all sit around in a circle and talk about what the question means to you, what you know about the answer to that question, and what you don't know.
Develop some guidelines, principles, your own operational principles that, for working with communities. That's always helpful, especially when there's, people coming in and out of a workplace.
Yeah. Beautiful. So that's a really helpful resource that people will be able to take away from this webinar, as well as all the other links that everyone's talked about today. They'll all be shared, including like the decolonising practice training that Cherie was talking about earlier. So we'll include links to all of those also in the chat. They will be on the screen, but we'll include them in the chat as well. So as we begin to wind down this discussion and we can all start to, relax and take a breath, I'd just like to ask each of you to just pause for a moment and think about what you learnt yourself. What are you taking away from this project, or what might, inform what you do next? So just, on a personal note. Jackie, maybe we'll start with you. What did you learn?
That context is everything. The foundational alignment was real. That the project was equally clear about that alignment. And it's not the same as readiness, and readiness is not the same as implementation. They're all different. But also that colonisation is at the forefront. Understanding why violence happens, why women don't report, why men feel lost, why our children sort of child protection, they're in the systems. I think talking about training and implementation that doesn't hold this centrally will miss the point. Violence is not our culture. Mm-hmm. I think language matters, how we speak about it. Have we got another question after this?
We sure do.
Okay. Well, finally, I think it's about trust as a methodology. I think the project itself modelled what it was teaching, and that's working at the speed of trust, the trust in the relationships between the researchers, between ourselves, between our organisations. Sorry, I kicked you then. Between our communities. So built slowly and carefully over time. So it's just not a means to an end, It's the way we work. So how it was done and the safety for our families is what I learnt.
Beautiful. Marlene, how about you?
Just a couple of things, because again, Jackie's wrapped it up so beautifully. It just reminds me of how important it is that we get this right. And I can't say it enough, our children are waiting. Our families are waiting. It's important that we have this safe collaboration, that non-Aboriginal orgs and workers, come on board and take on this practice and support your cultural brokers, workers in your area to make a difference for our communities in reducing domestic violence, abuse and neglect. How wonderful, important models like the Safe and Together are, especially models that say we're going to listen, we're going to have a look at what we should and shouldn't do, and assure that we implement those and implement them in a safe way. And just the importance, I think, that I often say it because a big part of the work I do, even outside of this project, is building collaboration. because we have to. That's why I love being involved in this. We need our non-Aboriginal organisations to step up, to be brave, to, as we've said, know what you should and shouldn't do. You know, take responsibility to carry that colonial load. Because, as Jackie said, our communities, it's not our culture what we're seeing. What we're seeing is a colonial impact. We're seeing intergenerational trauma. And we don't want to see another generation. So, yeah, just being able to work with such at such a speed and putting all those cultural protocols in place is just so important.
Sorry, and just to add to that, don't promise what you can't deliver.
No.
You know, be transparent
Not at all.
and own what you don't know.
Yeah.
Our people will respect you more if you say, I just don't know.
Yeah. And they'll let you know what you don't know.
Yeah.
And don't challenge that. Say, thank you, I'm listening.
Yeah.
I'm listening. And I'm going to go away and I'm going to implement that in my practice. Yeah.
Cherie, from you, what did you learn?
Yeah, I think, and we learnt it from a little bit from the other projects as well, is that good intentions don't really cut it. You know, you might think that you've got, you know, a good intention or you're trying to do something in a certain way, but you really have to do that deep listening and deep understanding. And like what Marlene said, you need to listen. And so I think the project allowed us to move away from the tick box, good intention, let's do this, we've got to sign off on this and we've got to do this, to a completely different way of working in the research space and having that reciprocal relationship sort of with the research partners, all of our team, with Safe and Together. It was a very open, transparent, and I think moved into a safe space to be able to do the work and have the conversations. And I do think if you have the intention to create the safe space and you work hard at that, then you will have that safe space and you will have those brave conversations and things can shift. And so I learned that from the project.
Thanks, Cherie. And just to add, don't do nothing.
Don't do nothing.
Yeah.
I love that.
Do not do nothing, because that's why we're seeing an unsupported service to communities.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I have one final question for you all to just round off this discussion. So this is your chance to leave people with some final words of wisdom as they walk away from the webinar. What is your final reflection on all of this work? Jackie, how about you? This is your last question.
My last hurrah?
Yeah.
Yeah, look out, everyone. I think we're still at the beginning. All right, the ALFIES project was significant, it was groundbreaking, and there's many more of these to come. All right, the model itself, I think, needs to keep evolving. Safe and Together was developed in sort of USA, and it was a wide, and while it was designed for the awareness of sort of racism and oppression, it was not sort of profound mistrust. It was not the profound mistrust of the Australian colonisation and stolen generations. The ALFIES project has given Safe and Together important feedback, okay? And the Institute, we've got a willingness, sort of a genuine interest in listening and to adapt it. And that's why localisation is so important. I think the system around the model needs to change. Even the best adapted sort of framework will fail if there's no sort of support from management, from your funding bodies. And Safe and Together can shift practitioner thinking, and it needs to shift sort of also the organisational thinking. I think Aboriginal led, it's not just the principle, it's the whole point. So the most important thing any government agency can do, or funder, is to resource it, is to trust it, is to follow the lead of the Aboriginal organisations. There's no other way around that. And finally, on a personal note, this work asks something of all of us, and it asks non-Indigenous sort of practitioners and researchers to sit with that discomfort and to examine our own assumptions and to accept that we're not always going to get it right. Even me as an Aboriginal practitioner, I'm not always going to get it right. So working at the speed of trust means willing to be accountable for any shortfall that I have and to keep showing up anyway. So that kind of humble, persistent commitment is what families at the centre of this work, it's what they deserve.
Oh, well said, Jackie.
My word.
How can you follow that, Marlene?
I was just going to say, I can't.
You can. You can.
Just everything to what Jackie said, and to be brave. We do have systems that, confine the work we do. We have funding bodies. Challenge it. Challenge it. Be an ally. Be an ally. Say, you know what? This is not meeting the human rights of a people here. This is not child safety. When we don't do nothing, or when we do more harm, we're not practicing as what the whole purpose of our practice is all about. So really, really reflecting every day on your practice. Really reflect, have I done all that we've discussed and talked about here today and more? Is it showing? Is the community accessing our service? It's a great example of if your organisation or you as a worker is safe. Be honest, be upfront, and more than anything else, I said, be brave and be an ally.
Cherie.
Cannot top either of those two things at all.
Jackie, with the little notes, right?
You two are amazing. Oh my God. I think if something to take away is that always remember that the community are experts. Community and ACCHOs have been doing this work for a very, very, very long time, and they know what they're doing. And the most important thing is to not come in over the top of any work like that with a white Western, sometimes medical model, and think that that's better because it's not going to be. I think that's really important. And I think if you're anyone who funds any sort of projects and you're listening to this, please allocate that resourcing and timeline into any sort of project or a service response to really respond to what Miles and Jackie have been saying here today and about the implementation work. I think those are really, really important things, because if you have that authorising environment and if you can embed these practices into the work, then you're at a good point, because we did have that. We were committed or encouraged to take the time to do that. So that's a critical part as well. But like Mal said, don't do nothing, and be brave and hold the space and hold the discomfort, and just listen deeply. I think that's all from me.
Thanks,
and no
Cherie.
two communities are the same.
No.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, we started this conversation with the question, can Safe and Together be implemented in Aboriginal communities? And I think we've really clearly answered that question, yes, if the time is taken to build those relationships, the time is taken to build your knowledge about where you're working and who you're working with. Funders can do this work if they embed flexible timeframes and realistic, respectful timeframes into their projects. And practitioners and non-Aboriginal practitioners can do this work if they are brave and they do something and they take action and they start to reach out and actually connect with people in their community. So with that, we've reached the end of our session, and I'd really like to thank our presenters for their insights and reflections and for sharing this important project with us. Thank you, Marlene. Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Cherie. A recording of this webinar will be available on the WorkUp website as soon as possible, and we encourage you to share it widely. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future Spark webinars, please don't hesitate to contact me at teresa.kellett@healingfoundation.org.au. I'm Teresa Kellett. On behalf of Work Up, thank you and goodbye.